Category 1 cable, also known as Cat 1, Level 1, or voice-grade copper, is a grade of unshielded twisted pair cabling designed for telephone communications, and at one time was the most common on-premises wiring installations of analog telephone systems, otherwise known as the plain old telephone service, POTS. Cat 1 cable was typically used for networks that carry only voice traffic, for example, telephones. The maximum frequency suitable for transmission over Cat 1 cable is 0.5 MHz. The second generation of Ethernet cables is Category 2, Cat 2, which was introduced in 1987 and first used for token ring networks. In telephone networks, Cat 2 cables are capable of transferring data as voice signals. Category 2, Cat 2, cables consist of only of two pairs of isolated copper wires, and they usually have an outer jacket. Category 2 cables function at a frequency from 1 MHz to 4 MHz, and they could transfer data at a speed from 1 to 4 megabits per second. Cat 2 Ethernet cables were used with RJ11 connectors, which are compatible with old voice telephones. The third generation of Ethernet cables is Category 3, Cat 3. It consists of three pairs of isolated copper wires isolated in an outer jacket. Cat 3 Ethernet cables were first used in 1991, and they introduced the 10BASE-T Ethernet standard. Category 3, Cat 3, cable can be used with frequency up to 16 MHz, which allow for 16 megabits per second data transfer bandwidth. However, the higher speed of Cat 3 over Cat 2 limited their layout distance to 100 meters, which became the standard distance for most Category cables that came after it. Cat 3 Ethernet cables were used with RJ12 connectors, which are compatible with old voice telephones just like RJ11 connectors. The fourth generation of Ethernet cables, Category 4, Cat 4, contained four pairs of isolated copper wires isolated in an outer jacket. The four pairs of twisted copper wires, used in Cat 4, became the standard for all forthcoming Cat cables. Consequently, the Cat 4 cables were the first to use the RJ45 connector in 1993, which remained the most common Ethernet network connector for many years, even today. Category 4, Cat 4, cable has a frequency range of up to 20 MHz, allowing for a data transfer capacity of 16 megabits per second. Cat 4 cables work with 10BASE-T Ethernet standard, but it was also used in token ring networks as a successor to Cat 2 cables. The fifth generation of Ethernet cables, Category 5, Cat 5, continued the four twisted pairs structure, but they were the first to use the most common 100BASE-T Ethernet standard in 1995. Cat 5 cables upped the signal frequency from 20 MHz to 100 MHz, and they could reach 100 megabits per second bandwidth along a 100 meters cable. The Category 5 generation came along the Internet boom from 1995 till 2001, which made it the most well-known Ethernet cable standard in history. Cat 5 cables are usually terminated by RJ45 connectors, as the most common standard. Cat 5e is an improved version of Cat 5, the fifth generation of Ethernet cables. In 2001, Category 5e cables were invented to increase the bandwidth 10 times over the Cat 5 cable. Cat 5e cables were the first to reach 1000 BASE-T Ethernet standard with a 1 gigabits per second speed bandwidth, using the same 100 MHz frequency of the Cat 5. Cat 5e helped technicians in making larger and more complex LAN network structures, even though they had a 55 meters range only. They also used the same RJ45 connector, and contributed in making even more favored. The sixth generation of Ethernet cables, Category 6, Cat 6, introduced the most crucial change in the structural design of an Ethernet cable. In 2002, Cat 6 cables were the first to have a central cross-shaped divider that isolated the four pairs of isolated copper wires from each other, to eliminate crosstalk. Not only that, the isolated pairs in Cat 6 had tighter and shorter twists, and some Cat 6 cables had an electromagnetic shield under the jacket, which helped reducing the crosstalk and interference even more. Category 6 cables used a 250 MHz frequency to reach the bandwidth of Cat 5e cables, 1 gigabits per second, but they could reach the full distance standard, 100 meters. In some cases, Cat 6 cables were used for 10 gigabit per second networks, but that limited their distance to 55 meters. Cat6a was introduced in 2008 as an improved version of Cat6, and it was the first to reach the 10G-base-T Ethernet standard. It used double the frequency, up to 500 MHz, and it could reach the 100 meters standard even when transferring at a 10 gigabits per second bandwidth. Augmented Category 6, Cat6a, cables kept the structure design of the Cat6 and the usage of RJ45 connectors as standard. However, they were commonly used for data center applications rather than office and home networks. The seventh generation of Ethernet cables, Category 7, Cat7, is mainly different from Cat6a by making the shielded cable structures mandatory, and it increased the frequency up to 600 MHz. Category 7 cables, which were introduced in 2010, also had a mandatory inner shield around each twisted pair, in addition to the center cross-shaped divider. Cat7 cables maintain the 10G-base-T Ethernet standard, which is 10 gigabits per second bandwidth along a 100 meters cable. However, they were the first generation to start utilizing additional connectors, like ARJ45, GG45 and Terra, but they maintain the RJ45 compatibility. Like Cat6a cables, Cat7 cables can be used at home or at the office, but they are mainly used in data center and professional environments. The Cat7a standards is an enhanced version of Cat7. Augmented Category 7, Cat7a, cables have a high frequency that reach 1000 or 1200 MHz, which allows them to transfer data up to 40 gigabits per second for up to 55 meters. In some cases, Cat7a cables are used for 100 gigabits per second connections, but only up to 15 meters. Just like its predecessor, Cat7a standard is compatible with RJ45, ARJ45, GG45, and Terra connectors. Because of that, it is mostly used in data centers and professional applications. The eighth generation of Ethernet cables, Category 8, Cat8, are the first to have a 2000 MHz frequency and to be 25G-base-T Ethernet standard compatible. However, Category 8, Cat8 Ethernet cables are divided into two categories, Cat 8.1 and Cat 8.2. On the first hand, Cat 8.1 standard was first introduced in 2016. It was called Cat 8 back then. It was the first Ethernet cable able to transfer up to 25 gigabits per second over 100 meters. Cat 8.1 can also transfer 40 gigabits per second, but only up to 33 meters. Cat 8.1 cable can be terminated with RJ45, ARJ45, GG45 or Terra connectors, and they can be used for home and office networks or in data centers and professional applications. On the second hand, Cat 8.2 cables use the same 2000 MHz frequency, but they are used for 40G-base-T Ethernet connections, which means Cat 8.2 cable can transfer data at a speed of 40 gigabits per second and up to 100 meters. In addition, the other significant difference of Cat 8.2 cables is they ditched the RJ45 connector and can only be terminated by ARJ45, GG45, and Terra connectors. Thus, Cat 8.2 cable are particularly used for data center and professional applications.